All right, I'm not going to do much review tonight. I do a little bit of review every week. But tonight we're just going to jump right in. And what we're going to see is tonight more of the transition to stage 5, as I laid out on that chart, the different stages that our culture went through. And we're going to see more tonight about how we moved on from stage 4 to stage 5. So kind of the beginning of the postmodern way of thinking we're going to start seeing tonight. So we talked about in the modern era that there were two main systems that were proposed as ways that we could achieve absolute certainty. So the idea was, the thinking was, human reason, our own human reason is how we can figure things out. Faith has kind of dropped off the scene here. The thinking was that reason is going to get us to absolute certainty. And we saw that René Descartes was one of the first to really propose this idea, that we could get to absolute certainty through our reason. And then different models or different strategies to get to absolute certainty were proposed. And these were the two top contenders. So rationalism versus empiricism. Long story short, empiricism won out. Not that it necessarily achieved absolute certainty, but it won out in terms of popularity. It became the method that the vast majority of people thought could get us to, or did get us to, absolute certainty. And it's probably because of all the success that we were having with our scientific discoveries. Cures for diseases, new technologies, and so it makes sense that empiricism won out in terms of popularity. But this quickly turned into empiricism, the birth of science. We could probably celebrate and be excited about, but what it turned into was a little bit too much pride in our own ability to figure things out, too much pride in our reason. So, as I said before, science, good. Scientism, not so much. So scientism was this attitude, really, that developed that we could figure everything out ourselves. Scientific knowledge was the only way to get real knowledge, to get knowledge that's absolutely certain, and all other types of knowledge just can't be trusted. Scientific knowledge becomes king in this way of thinking. Whereas I would say, as a pre-modern thinker, I would say science is a great strategy, a great way for us to learn truth, for us to understand what's really real, but it's not the only way. And I would say it also doesn't give us absolute certainty. So I would disagree with this scientism attitude. So as I said, what we're going to start seeing tonight is how this starts hitting a dead end. And I'm going to use that phrase a lot over the next few weeks, is that this way of thinking, this optimism in the modern era comes crashing down. So the modern era can be described as an era of extreme optimism, that we're going to figure everything out, that we can get absolute certainty in our knowledge, and this comes crashing down, and we're going to start seeing how that happened. How this path of reason by itself runs into all sorts of problems. It crashes and burns. So as I said, we're kind of moving on. We're going through history fairly quickly. But we're going to see now how we move from stage 3 and 4 into stage 5, where in the modern era, we're very optimistic that we can discover the ultimate answers, the meaning to life, our purpose, where we come from. But we're going to see here in stage 5 that pretty much it's concluded that there are no answers. And it becomes a very depressing, pessimistic, at least at first, this extreme pessimism, that almost a giving up. We tried this path of reason to get us to absolute certainty, to help us discover the ultimate answers, meaning, purpose of life. But we come to find out reason can't access those. In fact, that there are no answers to life, ultimate answers. So reason might be helpful in science and cures and technology, but in terms of getting at the ultimate answers, it's futile. It's not going to work. There are no ultimate answers. We're going to start to see just the beginnings of that process tonight. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to do it by focusing on these two main characters. So tonight we're going to look at David Hume, and then next week Immanuel Kant. And these two together are known as the critics of reason. These are the first two main thinkers who start pushing back against the optimism concerning reason in the modern era. So tonight we're going to start by taking a look at David Hume. Now, Hume is probably most well known as the most famous skeptic in history, the most famous skeptical philosopher. So he was one of those skeptics that was always pushing back. He was always playing the devil's advocate, so to speak. And that can be a useful exercise. I don't want to throw him under the bus per se. The skeptic, the devil's advocate, can be useful in critical thinking, can be useful in philosophy. One way that it can be useful is they chip away at our pride. Sometimes we get overconfident about what we believe or what we think is true, and the skeptic kind of maybe knocks that chip off of our shoulder, helps us realize, well, maybe our conclusions aren't as certain as we thought they were. So they can be helpful in that sense. They can also just help us think more about our positions and maybe refine our positions and strengthen our positions as we try to answer the skeptic. So one thing that I often do in conversation is just I want to give people, students, the freedom to play the devil's advocate. In whatever topic we're discussing. But think through, okay, I'm going to put a position out there, the existence of God, and here's an argument for the existence of God. Now, where do you see weaknesses in this argument? Play the devil's advocate, play the skeptic, and see maybe how we can improve this argument for God or an argument for the Bible, whatever the case may be. So Hume plays that role famously in the history of Western philosophy. He's the most famous skeptic. And just like everything, skepticism can also be taken too far as well. Because maybe you've been around people who just play the skeptic and they play it, they never give up. They push the envelope too far. And we're going to see this is actually what happens in Western thought, is it's an overreaction. We thought we could know things with absolute certainty. We thought we could get absolute truth in our knowledge. Then we realize that's not possible using our reason alone. And so we swing completely over to this other realm of skepticism where we can't know anything at all. So we can know everything. I guess we can't. Well, then we can't know nothing. We can know nothing. So Hume, he kind of shook the world by attacking the very root of empiricism. He goes after the jugular. He goes after science itself. And through this process, through his criticism, really, I would say, shook the entire world, shook the thinking of the time. And we'll see how out of his critique, there's a sense in which postmodernism rose out of his critique and his demolishing of modernism. So let's take a look at his critique. He was a Scottish philosopher, so not from the continent. He was up from the Great Britain area. And he challenged this optimism. Now, specifically what he challenged was a key tenet of empiricism. The specific thing that he challenged was this idea among empiricists that all of our knowledge comes from our experience. might remember John Locke and how he described us as a tabula rasa, a blank slate in terms of our knowledge, and that we only get knowledge through our sense experience. So he's going to attack that idea. Basically, he's going to say, look, if all of our knowledge comes from our experiences via our senses, then absolute certainty is not possible. The empiricists are wrong. Now remember what the empiricist does. Remember how the scientific method works, how induction works. They study particulars, do a lot of scientific experiments, if you will, make a lot of scientific observations, and from those particulars conclude a general truth, or try to conclude or glean from all of the particular things that they've looked at some sort of a general law or a universal truth from studying all those particulars. That's the scientific method, empiricism, induction, just different words describing that same process. So take a simple example that Hume used, swans. So we're going to go out and look at swans and try to ascertain the color of swans. So maybe we'll go out and we'll look at 100 swans, and they're all white. Maybe we'll go out and eventually maybe get a few scientists, and we could study 1,000, maybe even up to 1,000,000 swans, let's say. And we discover that every swan that we study, every swan that we see is white. And so we could, possibly as an empiricist, conclude, based on our empirical observations, a universal truth that all swans are white. I'm just giving you a very simple, example of how this empiricism works. All of our knowledge comes from sense experience. In this case, we're using our eyes, our sense experience, to look at the color of swans. We study enough swans so then we can conclude try to make an absolute truth with absolute certainty that all swans are white. But Hume said, wait a second. Maybe you've gone a little too fast there. Hume tried to point out that we can't get to 100% certainty with this if all of our knowledge comes from our experience. This is called the problem of induction. The problem of induction. As finite creatures with finite minds, it's impossible for us to study every single particular out there. In order to be absolutely certain, we would need to study not just 1,000,000 swans, we would have to study every swan that ever existed, past, present, and future. That would be the only way to make an absolute certain conclusion about the color of swans. And as finite creatures, we just can't do that. We can't go back in time, we can't go in the future, we can't even look at all the swans that exist at the present. So again, if our knowledge comes from only our experience, there's no way we could get absolute certainty when it comes to the color of swans. There might be a purple one out there that we just haven't discovered yet. Or maybe in 1,000,000 years from now, a purple one will be born. I know this is kind of a silly example, but you see what Hume's getting at here. We might become 99% confident that all swans are white, but empiricism can't get us to that 100%. We might be comfortable with that. As pre-modern thinkers, maybe in the room, we're comfortable, not having absolute certainty. But for the thinkers of the time who thought that they'd have accomplished it, this was a heavy blow. This was pretty intimidating, the things that Hume was pointing out. Here's another way to illustrate the problem. Let's say you've got a sack, and you know nothing about this sack, where it came from, what the contents of the sack are, and let's say you just start pulling things out of the sack one at a time. And the first thing you pull out is a brown bean. Second thing is a brown bean. Let's say 10 things in a row you pull out, and they're all brown beans. You might conclude that the 11th thing you pull out is also going to be a brown bean. I mean, that would be reasonable. And Hume says, yeah, that's a very reasonable assumption. The problem is, you can't know with absolute certainty that the 11th thing you pull out is going to be a brown bean. If that's the bar you're reaching for, if that's the bar that empiricism is claiming it's achieved, Hume says, not so fast. There's no way we could know with absolute certainty that the 11th thing is going to be another brown bean. This is one of the reasons why Hume said that all of our knowledge degenerates into probability. And this is a very skeptical blow to the optimism at the time, that all of our knowledge is just probability. We can say probably it's going to be a brown bean. We could say probably all swans are white. We can say probably when we do that scientific experiment for the 1,000th time, we're going to get the same result. But we can't know with absolute certainty. That's his point here. We could do the same scientific experiment 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000,000 times, 1,000,000,000,000 times, and even if we get the same result all those times, we can't know with absolute certainty that the next time we do it, we're going to get the same result. We could conclude that, and he's not saying it'd be irrational to conclude that. It'd be very reasonable to say the next time we do the scientific experiment, we're going to get the same result because we got the same result 1,000,000 times before. But his point is there's no way we could know with absolute certainty, just like the bean. So replace the silly bean and bag example with scientific experiments. We can't know with absolute certainty that the 1,000,000th time we're going to get the same result. Now, these are all silly examples that he's using just to, make his point more easier for us to understand. But when he takes these conclusions and applies them to the things that people thought they knew with absolute certainty, that's when it becomes crushing to people's thinking. So he goes right for the jugular and goes after Newton's laws. Now remember how much Newton was celebrated here in this era. Newton was the Einstein of the day, and the things that Newton discovered, those are the things we know with absolute certainty. I mean, we can do these experiments with his laws of motion. You probably had to do them in high school like I did. These experiments with gravity over and over and over again, and we always get the same result. But Hume says, is it really a universal law? How could we know that with absolute certainty? Just because Newton said it? Just because we see 1,000,000, billion, trillion apples fall to the ground when they disconnect from the tree, we can't know with absolute certainty that the next one will. We're making a leap here. We're making a leap of seeing all these experiments, seeing all these things, and concluding absolute certainty, or concluding a universal law here. Again, if all of our knowledge, this is the claim of the empiricist, if all of our knowledge comes from experience, then there's no way we can be absolutely certain. Now, next, Hume is going to go after the very heart of the scientific enterprise. The next thing he applies this to is the very heart of science. And that's the idea of causality. So science, if you think about it, really science is just the study or search for causes. So when we do science, we're looking for what caused X. The crops are dying. What's causing the crops to die? Is it something with the weather? Is it some sort of an insect? Is it some sort of a poison that our neighbor put on our crops? What is the cause here? So science can be thought about as just the study of causes, the search for causes. And so Hume is going to apply this skepticism to causality itself. The idea that X causes Y. So like gravity causes the apple to fall. But he's going beyond gravity now to the very root of science, the root of empiricism, and that is causality. Now he says, look, we just use another silly example. We see on a billiard table, a pool table, the white ball hitting the red ball, and then the red ball flies off in the opposite direction. And we see that happen a million times, right? Or you can think of in baseball, the bat hitting the baseball and the baseball flies off in the opposite direction. And we see that happen again and again and again and again, and we develop this idea that the white ball caused the red ball to fly off in the other direction. I mean, that's a reasonable thing to think. We've seen it happen so many times, and we think that there must be a law of causality, the law of cause and effect, if you will. And it's a universal, it's an absolute truth, and we can know it with absolute certainty. But again, he applies the same routine as we've seen to this idea of causality. Just because we've seen it before doesn't mean that it'll happen again. At least we can't know with absolute certainty if our knowledge only comes from our sense experience. Let me explain it to you this way. In our sense experience, we don't see this has to or this have to. We don't see this cause. All we see is the effect. With our sense experience, all we see is the effect of the white ball hitting the red ball. We don't see the cause or this have to or this universal truth of causation. We can't experience that with our senses. With our senses, all we can experience is the effects. And so according to Hume, what we've developed here is a habit. This idea of causation is actually, now catch this, there's a lot of foreshadowing here. The idea of causation is a habit of the mind, and we project that idea of causation onto reality. So that from our sense experience, we can't know, about these laws, these so-called universal laws of causality. It's just a habit we've developed, a way of thinking, a habitual way of thinking, this idea of causality, and then we project that habitual way of thinking onto reality. It's not something out there, well, if it is, we can't know it from our sense experience, and we're actually projecting our idea of causality onto it. So do you see that? Maybe you know a little bit more about postmodernism, and you see the foreshadowing here about ideas coming from our mind instead of ideas or truths in reality itself. We'll explore that more over the next several weeks. But we're starting to see some roots of it here. Sometimes when you read Hume, you almost get the idea that, look, causality can't be proven, so we just have to take a leap of faith and believe it. And so you're starting to see here some of this irrational faith idea. Oftentimes I call it faith alone or faith by itself or faith broken off from reason, but I think calling it irrational faith might be a good descriptive term, because what it communicates is it's faith, it's believing something irrationally. We have no rational reason to believe in causality, so we take an irrational leap of faith and just believe it. We believe in causality. We can't prove it. We can't know it with absolute certainty. Reason's not helpful here because it doesn't give us absolute certainty, so we take an irrational leap of faith. Now, Hume doesn't use those exact words, but you start to see some of those ideas in Hume that get picked up later.
Did anybody challenge Hume on this idea?
Oh yeah, that's what Kant.
That's the definition of stupidity, doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different outcome.
Yeah.
I'm surprised somebody surely had to say, hey, wait a second.
Yeah. Now again, he believes in all this stuff. He just doesn't think we can prove it with absolute certainty. So, but yes, he was challenged, and we're going to see Kant's whole philosophy was initiated to defeat Hume's skepticism. And we'll touch base on that here at the end. But next week, we're going to spend the whole week on Kant.
Presently, philosophers debate these same topics.
Yeah, there are. I would say the vast majority of philosophers have concluded we can't achieve absolute certainty. And so that's what Hume is going after. Hume's going after the idea of absolute certainty. And so I would be right there with Hume this whole way. Everything that I've said so far about Hume, I agree with. But most philosophers today have concluded, the modern attempt, the attempt in the modern era to achieve absolute certainty just isn't possible. And so there's not really a need for this sort of skepticism anymore, if that makes sense. Because there's nobody out there who's still claiming absolute certainty. If there was, I'd pull out Hume and throw it at him. But there's just not a need to do that anymore because people aren't claiming absolute certainty that I know of. Now, one thing about this foreshadowing, this idea of irrational faith, well, we just got to believe it, that was a very pessimistic conclusion for Hume. So we're going to see how this idea of irrational faith actually becomes, for our Western culture, a good thing that's celebrated. And irrational faith is the way to get at the ultimate answers. But here, for Hume, as the skeptic, that's like a negative conclusion for him. This is like a pessimism for him. That, well, we can't know with absolute certainty, so we just got this irrational faith. We just got to believe in causality. So let me ask you guys, what do you think of Hume so far? We're going to talk a little bit more about him, but just at this point, what are your thoughts? Like, dislike, agree, disagree?
Yeah, definitely like his approach to that. I think we should most people take that approach because when you look back, it is frustrating to be able to provide a solution to get the problems and some thought that ways of thinking that actually more effective than more difficult to get.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, the skeptic's job is a lot easier than the proponent's job, right? Because the skeptic just has to poke holes and criticize, but they usually don't offer something original, or they don't offer their own theory. So sometimes the skeptic can be just frustrating and annoying, and I totally agree with that.
You mentioned the upsides of playing devil's advocate is being able to see by practicing your conclusions and whatnot. What are the downsides of playing devil's advocate? Like what issues can arise from that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as long as it's done respectfully and done constructively, but I guess the negative aspect I was pointing out is just if that's all somebody's going to do is just throw rocks, and they're not really helping you develop your argument or develop your position, they're just throwing rocks at it, and they're just overly skeptical, and they're not going to believe anything no matter what you give them, then it just becomes an annoyance, if that makes sense. It can still be helpful, right? I mean, I've had encounters with somebody who it's like, all right, they're not going to believe in what I'm trying to convince them of no matter what, and they're just kind of playing the skeptic and having fun with it. And it can still be helpful for me because then when I go back and I reflect and I think about it, it can help me refine my position. So it can still be useful, but it's just annoying. And I guess, if the skeptic gets to the point where they're not just having fun and playing around, but they actually develop a total skepticism, this can happen to people, where they become almost immobilized and frozen in uncertainty. And it gets like depressive. It can be like, well, if I can't know anything with absolute certainty, then I just can't know anything at all. And it gets to be very bothering to them. How do I know anything? And this total skepticism can be very damaging, I guess, is another negative aspect of it. if somebody takes it that far.
Otherwise, dead end. Is that what you're talking about?
I think so. Yeah, when I use the phrase dead end, I'm more referring to how this optimism hit a dead end. Yeah, so the optimism, the idea that reason can figure things out with absolute certainty, that hits a dead end. All right, any other thoughts about Hume? Like, dislike? Well, I haven't told you everything about Hume, but at this point, a lot of folks who've never heard about Hume before really like him. Because he's knocking the chip off the shoulder of modernism. He's kind of pointing out where they've gotten a bit too prideful in their own reason. And in that sense, I think he can be appreciated. However, what I would prefer that Hume would do would be to encourage people back to like the pre-modern way of thinking. I would hope that, he would see the errors of modernism and recognize that the pre-modern way of thinking, faith and reason working together, would be the right solution, that we should go back to stage 2, if you will. But Hume is famously known as a skeptic of science, but even more so famously is known as the skeptic of religion. So he hates religion. Doesn't hate science. Okay, he thinks science is the best knowledge we can have. It just doesn't get us absolute certainty. So he's not a science hater. He's just knocking down the empiricists who thought they could achieve absolute certainty. He doesn't hate science, loves science, just doesn't think he can get us. What he does hate is religion. He's one of the first famous agnostics or atheist. Historians debate, whether he was an atheist or an agnostic. He builds long arguments against the existence of God, against believing in miracles. There's still people writing books today trying to defeat Hume's argument against miracles. That comes up all the time in philosophy. So at the time, it was very common, like we're in stage 4, you can see it was very common to reject special revelation, reject miracles. And so him arguing against miracles in the Bible, that's not all that uncommon. But he went beyond deism, and it's one of the first early famous atheists. And so he was even arguing against the existence of God. He's got a book called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Natural religion being deism, that just believes that God speaks to us only through nature. So here's just an example of his writing and about how much he loves science, doesn't give it to an 100% certainty, but he loves science, hates religion. Very famous quote from Hume. He said, "If we take in our hand any volume of divinity, any theology book, or school of metaphysics, proposing that there are things that exist beyond the physical world. If we take any books like that, let us ask of those books, do they contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? Math. Do they contain any math? No. Well, do they contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? Do they contain any science? No. Well, then take those books and commit them to the flames, for they can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion." So definitely was a skeptic of religion, much more so than science. So where I would say his skepticism is helpful is that it corrects the optimism of modernism. But we don't want to go too far the other direction and let this skepticism immobilize us. I think it's appropriate to recognize, yes, we're finite. We can never achieve absolute certainty because we're not God. We're not omniscient. But we don't have to be pessimistic about it. We don't have to throw our hands up in the air and say, well, if we can't know with absolute certainty, then we can't know at all. No, I think there's an appropriate middle ground for us as finite creatures in our knowledge. And we'll talk about that. So again, as we see often in Western history, there's a reaction, and now we're going to see an overreaction. So there's a sense in which postmodernism really is just the overreaction to the failure of modernism. We thought we could achieve absolute certainty. Come to find out that's a dead end. We can't get absolute certainty. And so we swing completely over. The pendulum swings completely the other way to conclude, well, we can't know anything at all. It's an overreaction, too pessimistic overreaction, where the pre-modern way of thinking would be, in the middle. We can't be 100% certain, but we don't have to throw up our hands in the air and conclude we can't know anything. So that takes us to Immanuel Kant. And Kant is one of those pivotal, key transitional figures in history. I mean, he is probably definitely in the top 5 thinkers in Western history, maybe the top 3. So oftentimes people will say, I've heard many philosophers say, the top 3 thinkers in Western history were Plato, Aristotle, and Immanuel Kant. So he's that huge of a figure in terms of influence. He's one of these strange figures that is cardinal or pivotal, because kind of like Descartes, right? Descartes is considered the father of modernism. It's Descartes' method, it's Descartes' foundationalism, his critical method, that kind of moved us from the pre-modern era to the modern era. Kant is the key critical figure that moves us from modernism to postmodernism. In him is kind of the culmination of the modern attempt at reason alone, but also at the same time, the roots of this idea of irrational faith, this idea, the limits of reason, that reason hits a dead end, and instead we've got to make this irrational leap of faith, breaking faith and reason apart for good. So Kant claims to achieve absolute certainty, but in doing so, he breaks faith and reason apart and promotes this idea of irrational faith, faith apart from reason. Now we're going to spend all next week on Kant, but let me just tell you a few things about him to prepare. So Kant admits, and this is what I was referring to earlier, Kant admits that Hume is the one who woke him up from his dogmatic slumber. This is one of those famous quotes in the history of philosophy. So Kant explains, look, I was asleep in my dogmatic slumber. What does he mean by that? Well, like most people, he thought, achieving absolute certainty wasn't that big of a deal. He said, oh, yeah, we could do that in our sleep. He was dogmatic. He was absolutely confident we could achieve absolute certainty. And he thought we could attain it like most everybody did, that optimism of the modern era. But Hume woke him up from that. Hume woke him up from that over-optimism that he was asleep in. And so Kant began a 12-year project to try to refute Hume. He recognized the problems that Hume was pointing out, that if Hume was right, even science itself was in trouble. The law of causality itself was being attacked. And so he wanted to refute Hume. And so Kant sets out on this 12-year project to try to overcome Hume's skepticism. And his goal, Kant's goal, is to try to protect absolute certainty. His goal is to try to protect our absolute certain knowledge. He saw Hume as attacking that, and he wanted to protect it. Now, Kant is very difficult to read, and not many people read Kant directly because he's very difficult to read. But his influence in Western thought cannot be overestimated. In fact, I had a seminary professor once that said, and I think he's correct in this, Immanuel Kant, or no, how did he say it? He said, Christians in our churches today have been influenced in their thinking more by Immanuel Kant than they have by Jesus Christ. Even though they've probably never even heard of Immanuel Kant. But his thinking has just reverberated down through our culture in all the art forms and in most every way that people, our culture gets its information, mostly through art, not the direct study of the philosophers. The philosophers come up with the ideas, the artists pick them up, and then communicate them down through their art forms, literature, books, and nowadays TV, movies, radio, music, poetry. But through all those means, Immanuel Kant's way of thinking has trickled down and become the majority of the way people think today, even in the church, though they don't even know who Kant is. So it's important, even though it's difficult, we want to work through Kant's project and what he has done and the errors that have come from it. So this is our last slide for the night, I believe. Yep. And I just want to kind of give you a heads up about what we're going to go through. We're going to be done a little bit early tonight. Next week we might go longer than an hour because Kant is just so important. As I said, he's one of those pivotal thinkers. He's in one sense, he's the culmination of modernism and the root of the next era, the root of postmodernism. You can kind of just tell from the title of his books, what he's getting at, the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, the critique of judgment, the three main books that he's most well known for. But really what we're going to focus on is his three tasks. We're going to flesh this out all next week. This is what he attempted to do in his philosophy. Hume is the one who woke him up from his dogmatic slumber, and in response to Hume, he's going to set out to try to do these three things. He's going to try to first rescue reason and science back from Hume. Okay, he wants to protect that absolute certainty. So he wants to rescue science and reason from Hume's crushing skepticism. But in doing so, this accomplishes his next goal. In doing that, in doing number one, he limits the reach of reason. So you can see he's rescuing reason in one sense, but by rescuing it, and this will make more sense next week, he has to limit it. So in a sense, reason is good, and it works, and it gives us absolute certainty in this box. But it can't go outside the box. So it's successful, absolute certainty, number one, as long as it stays in the box, number two. Reason cannot reach outside the box, and that'll make more sense. But in doing this is why Kant is so impressive, as he supposedly, accomplishes all these things in his philosophy. In doing so, he rescues faith. He's a Christian. He was raised in a very pious Lutheran environment and loves Christianity and is very concerned that reason is being used to try to disprove Christianity. So he feels like in doing number one and number two, he protects the Christian faith. He rescues faith from being disproven through reason. So this is one way that he says it. He says, I had to limit knowledge in order to make room for faith. So you see, even in his mindset here, he's thinking of faith and reason as opposites. He's got to limit reason, he's got to limit knowledge, shrink it down, put it in its place, keep it in the box to make room for faith. Because he's thinking of these things as opposites. Whereas remember, and we'll do a lot of this next week, is compare his, what I would call, postmodern way of thinking to a pre-modern way of thinking where faith and reason work together. And we spent several weeks, I tried to make the case from the Bible, how faith and reason work together. A lot of early Christian philosophers describe faith and reason working together. And he is going to propose something else. Faith and reason are opposites. They're even enemies. Even if he doesn't say that, others will come after him and say it. But he wants to limit reason to make room for faith. And in his case, he's referring to the Christian faith. It may seem good, and especially if you've grown up in the Western culture, it's going to make a lot of sense because that's the way we've been influenced to think. But I'll try to make the case that his philosophy is a disaster, that it actually gives birth to postmodernism. So there's a sense in which, again, kind of like Descartes, he had good motives. Descartes set out to try to prove the existence of God. Kant setting out to protect the Christian faith. So they might have the right motives, but what they end up producing is a disaster. Descartes setting off the modern era, and Kant setting off pre-modern or postmodernism. Probably not. Probably not. And some people would say, look, it wasn't necessarily them making an error, or if they did, it was a slight error, but it was those who came after them who took their idea too far. And sometimes I can sympathize with that, but then I go back and I read these guys again, and I'm like, no, the error is there right from the beginning. And to me, his main error is to think of faith and reason as opposites. So I see the error right there from the beginning. Now, other people come along and they take that error and run with it, but the error is there. But Kant might very well be in heaven, right? I mean, we might get to glory and see Kant, and I'd like to have a word with him. But it's so strange when you think about how Christians might have been the ones who gave birth to because usually, postmodernism, especially in our churches, is kind of thrown out there as this demon, right? The postmodern demon, so to speak. But it's interesting that it was birthed out of a so-called Christian attempt to protect Christian faith. And I'm hoping that I'm piquing your interest. But it's just, again, I see this thinking running rampant in our culture and our churches. And so part of my motivation in this is to protect the church. As a pastor, as a shepherd, that's part of my calling, is to shepherd the church, protect the church from bad thinking. And so one of the reasons I study and teach philosophy is to expose where this bad thinking comes from, so we're not influenced more by Kant than we are by Christ. So that's part of my goal in teaching this stuff and helping people understand and see it.
Can you give us an example of why your professor would have said that Kant had more influence than Christ? What would be a modern day example of that?
Faith and reason are enemies. Faith and reason are opposites. I see that in the church so often that, faith and reason are opposites, enemies. And you were here for the first few weeks, I tried to make the case from the Bible that that's not true. And
Really, apologetics is really interjecting reason with faith, isn't it? I mean, that's really what apologetics is, having a reason for your faith.
yep, yep. And that's why I'm very comfortable with apologetics, because it's my understanding of faith is that it's you're trusting in something based on good reasons and evidence. You weren't here for the first few weeks, but that's how I define faith, is trusting something based on good reason and evidence. But there's a reason why apologetics died for about 150 years. And in fact, there's a lot of churches and Christians that are very against apologetics. I won't go into it all tonight, but I still encounter a lot of objection to apologetics from churches and Christians, because what I would argue is that they've been influenced by Kant instead of the Bible, and so they see faith and reason as enemies, and they're like, trying to give reasons for your faith? That's like saying the number 3 is blue. It doesn't make any sense to them. I mean, if I could prove Christianity, then there'd be no need for faith. I mean, it's that sort of thinking. And so apologetics literally died for about 150 years. You go back to the 1700s, early 1800s, apologetics is everywhere. Pastors are doing apologetics. Theologians, philosophers are doing apologetics, giving reasons and evidence to believe Christianity is true. And then, boom, it dies out. And for 150 years, nobody's doing apologetics. Because it's all about faith. It's all about irrational faith. How you feel, your choices, your will. Faith is not about reason, it's irrational leap of faith. But then you start to see, maybe around the 70s, apologetics making a comeback. And some of the early apologists like Montgomery, Schaeffer, Geisler, Josh McDowell in the 70s. And then now it's coming back into the church, but there's still a lot of opposition to it because people think in Kantian terms that faith and reason just don't mix.
I see by the syllabus that we're not going to discuss Haman at all. And Haman has piqued my interest.
Who?
Haman.
Haman.
Johann, this is the one that was in our reading.
Yeah, he was the one in our reading, and I'm thinking, I don't know if I've ever really heard of him.
Maybe I haven't either.
I'm sure you have. But he talked about, he was a Presbyterian minister, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I was just really intrigued by this man that I had never heard of before.
Okay.
And he had such a Christian influence at that time.
Okay, so let's look at the class schedule if you want to pull out that and kind of see where we're at. So tonight, September 24th, you guys had to do quite a bit of reading for this week. Finish the Tilt-A-Whirl book, and then Chapter 9 in Christian Philosophy. Reading summary, just the Christian Philosophy Chapter 9. So make sure you email those to Caleb today. And then I gave a lecture on Hume. Next week, October 1st, no reading. So reading is going to start, be less reading for you to do now. And this week there's no reading, but that will give you time to write your book review. So you need to write your 5-page, I believe, book review on the Tilt-A-Whirl book, and that's due next Thursday. You'll have to email it to Caleb on that day. And you can look at the syllabus. We've talked about the requirements for the book review, but that's in the syllabus if you need a reminder. The 8th, you've got just 20 pages of reading, not too much, October 8th. And then on the 15th, to get ready for class on the 15th, there's not going to be any reading because we want to give you time to study for the midterm. Okay. Oh, no, to take the midterm. I apologize. So actually on the 8th, we will hand out the midterm to you at the end of class. Well, I'll have to work with Caleb to see how he's going to get that to everybody. But Caleb will get you the midterm exam on October 8th, and then you'll have a week to take it. It's open note, and take as much time as you want on it. It's take home, open note, open book exam, and then you have to email it back to him on October 15th. Anybody have any questions about the class schedule and requirements, stuff that's due, when it's due, how it's due? All right, again, those of you taking online, if you have any questions about all that stuff, email Caleb. Any questions about the content, go ahead and reach out to me.